Hello and welcome to the Interplex. Ashish Kothari is an Indian environmentalist and author working at the Development Environment Interface. He is a founder and coordinator of several nonprofit organizations and initiatives, including Kalpavriksh, Vikalp Sangam, Global Tapestry of Alternatives, and Radical Ecological Democracy. Kothari holds a master's degree in sociology and taught environmental issues at the Indian Institute of Public Administration in New Delhi through the mid-1990s, while later serving as a professor at the National Law School of India in Bengaluru and as guest faculty internationally, including at Bowdoin College in the US. He has served on and chaired numerous national and international steering committees, boards, and tribunals, including as coordinator for India's National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan and as a judge on the International Tribunal on the Rights of Nature. Over his 4+ decades of dedicated work, he has also authored, co-authored, or edited more than 30 books, including Churning the Earth, Alternative Futures, and Pluriverse, a post-development dictionary, and has written or co-written more than 600 articles. In our expansive interdialogue, we spoke about the fascinating, diverse, and complex biocultural context of India, as well as the importance of interdisciplinary and intercultural collaboration, and the need for more effective multimodal communication on urgent social and environmental issues. We also spoke about traditional governance structures and how they can inform a rethinking of development and harmony, as well as how to move beyond rights of nature into what Kothari calls earthy governance. Hi there, Ashish. Good evening, your time. Good morning, my time.
Hi, good morning. I'm well, thanks.
Thanks for being with us here today.
Mm-hmm.
So, I'd like to get started a little bit with your sort of personal trajectory from into and out of sociology, maybe academia, into civil society, working a bit with policy as well. How has this transpired for you, and especially getting involved with communities and biocultural work?
Well, I mean, actually, from high school time itself, I was quite interested in nature, being out in nature, and then getting more and more concerned about what was happening. I was growing up in New Delhi, and it was a city that was getting from bad to worse. And also there was a sort of a large city forest. There is a large city forest in Delhi, and we used to go there to just enjoy ourselves and be part of nature. And then we saw a lot of destruction. So that was the beginning of, let's say, my interest, but also concern with regard to ecological destruction and damage. And then beginning to look at economic policies, what the government, what India is calling development or the world is calling development, and then beginning to kind of interrogate it, along with, even from that time, sort of visiting a lot of the grounded movements of resistance against timber logging and mining and commercial fishing and things like that. So in those first few years, I got quite a heavy dose of the politics of environmental decision making, and the issues, the problems with how development itself is defined, the issues of democracy and authoritarianism, or like who's taking decisions for whom and against whom, etc. That's a grounding I had right then. And then from my interest in nature and conservation and wildlife and so on, sort of increasingly looking at livelihood rights, political decision making, until sort of now. I'm cutting a long story short. This is about 48 years back. So in the last 15 years or so, especially looking at, because we've been doing a lot of critiques of development and critiques of decision making and governance. So what are the alternatives? Like what's emerging also from the ground? So all along, actually learning from communities, whether it's resistance or the construction of alternatives in terms of basic needs and governance and gender justice and food and water and energy and all of that. And then trying to make sense of what does it mean in terms of frameworks that could be radical alternatives to the currently dominant models of development and governance, etc. So that's, in brief, the sort of trajectory that I've been through.
And at what point did you get involved specifically in the NGO space with Kalpavriksh, and what is it, Global Tapestries of Alternatives, Vikalp Sangam. I know you're involved with various different initiatives, but what made you realize that you needed to transition to the civil society space to make more of an impact?
Well, that actually also happened at the same time in high school when we began to take up these issues, like the issue of the destruction of the urban forest in New Delhi, or supporting movements like the anti-logging movements and the Chipko movement in the Himalaya against logging and others, that we realized that doing this just as individuals is not as effective as actually having an organization. But there were very few NGOs at that point in time. So we decided that we would set up a youth group. And that's when Kalpavriksh was formed, actually, 1979. And I was just about moving out of my high school and into college. So that was the first step. And then we also realized that just like a bunch of individuals can't do very much, you have to have some sort of an organization identity. One organization also can't do very much in the face of the kind of macro forces that we are confronting. So therefore, the need for more and more networking with other organizations, other movements. And so we have helped to set up or been part of a number of such networks within India and globally. And the two that I'm currently involved in, three actually, they're currently involved in at the India level, there's something called the Vikalp Sangam, which means the confluence of alternatives, which currently has almost about 100 organizations and movements around the country who are struggling on resistance and sort of reconstruction. And then globally, something we started back in 2008 called the ICCA Consortium, which is now a network of about 200 indigenous peoples, local communities, civil society organizations that are trying to defend their territories.
Also in India? Also in India?
No, that's global.
Global.
So global. And then in the last 7 years or so, the Global Tapestry of Alternatives, which is going beyond particular themes to looking at across all themes and across geographies and cultures, creating a platform which can be much more global, again, bringing movements of radical alternatives together. So these are 3 or 4 that I'm part of or have been part of. So.
Great. And
but the impulse has been the same, basically, that we need to have more and more of a collective voice, more and more of a critical mass to effect the kind of changes that we want. But that all of these have to be rooted on the ground in terms of actual practical action that communities and collectives are taking, but then also looking at national, global scenarios, kind of local to global kind of action.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to ask, what is the role and how have you and your colleagues been able to foster these kinds of international collaborations? Logistically speaking, how do you bring together the voices of the different communities and establish the differences and the similarities in these collective voices?
Well, if I give the experience of the ICCA Consortium, which is global, I mean, the idea of, not the idea, but the practice of community-led conservation, not what we at that point called community conserved areas, began from our experience in India of people on the ground who are protecting forests or other ecosystems or wildlife species, of course, linked to their own livelihoods and their own cultural identity and so on. And we realized in speaking to, at that point, I and a few others were involved with global institutions like the IUCN, or were part of the ongoing negotiations of the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity. So we were meeting a lot of people who were doing somewhat similar work in other parts of the world. And those relationships kind of came together in the late 1990s and early 2000s to create platforms or forums of arguing for local community rights within what is called protected areas, that is government established protected areas. Unfortunately, the Western model of doing that has been to kick people out or to stop people from using their traditional resources and, of course, deny traditional knowledge as being important for conservation. So we were pushing for a rights-based, indigenous local knowledge or multiple knowledge systems-based conservation thing, and also then saying people are protecting things on their own. So the community conserved areas thing we introduced in the global arena, which then became what's called ICCAs, or Indigenous Peoples and Local Community Conserved Territories. and areas, or in short, territories of life. So what we did was to make a lot of relationships, create the sort of dialogues at these global forums to say, we think we need something like this. Do you also think so? And as we get resonance from others saying, yes, this is very, very important to have something like that at a global level or regional and global level, then we say, okay, well, let's start something. But the beginnings are often just informal relationships until we feel that there is a critical mass enough to make a formal institution. So that's why I said it started late 1990s, but we made the established the ICCA Consortium only in 2008.
I see.
Similarly, similarly with Vikalp Sangam in India, that we've had relationships of all kinds for the last 40, 45 years. And then to sort of start talking to people to say, okay, do we need a forum on radical alternatives? Because there are a number of forums already there, right? So for instance, in India, we have a very active forum called the National Alliance for People's Movements, which has brought together many, multiple different kinds of movements together for the last 25 years. But we felt that there was a need for something similar, but focusing almost exclusively on radical alternatives and linking to NAPM and others who are doing resistance, right? So, but the processes were the same of talking, establishing trust, starting, slowly, not doing something like going from 0 to 100 in a night, creating those relationships of trust, and also trying to bring the sense of horizontal functioning, which we have tried to maintain in Kalpavriksh, in the organization we helped to start long back, that there is no boss. Everybody is part of decision making. So we've tried to bring the same sense into some of these networks. It's not easy, of course. You have 100 organizations. It's not easy to have horizontality. There's all kinds of invisible and visible hierarchies that come in. But at least to attempt to say that, okay, there is no, Ashish Kothari, for instance, does not take any decisions. It will always be as many people are there in a room or in the organization that everybody has an equal voice. How do we make that happen? So these are some of the aspects of creating these kinds of networks.
And many of the principles that you're applying to these larger networks at scale, I imagine, are learned from the collaborations that you've helped to build with the communities themselves, the establishing trust, taking time for dialogue, and being able to build projects together and everybody having a voice in the decision making. I'd like to ask you, because our audience, a lot of my work, as you know, has been focused in Latin America. There are a lot of similarities, but there's going to be a lot of diversity and differences as well. Maybe you can give a bit of a panorama of the landscape of this kind of work and just sort of what exists in India in terms of intercultural collaborations, biocultural work. What are it's hard to put like one big generalization, which we shouldn't do anyways, but what is kind of the landscape of worldviews and work being done between the civil society space and communities, traditional knowledge systems, just to give some context for people that might have worked more in Latin America?
Yeah, well, as you know from your work here, India is actually multiple countries put into one. And because a lot of our work also extends to South Asia as a whole, you're talking about not just 1/4 or 1/6 of the world's population, but also an incredible diversity of cultures, of languages, of ecosystems, of ways of being, ways of knowing, ways of living, so knowledge systems, etc., right? Many of these erased or become much weaker because of colonization and post-independent kind of carryover of the same colonial kind of policies of homogenization and so on, and modernization of certain kinds, but nevertheless still surviving in various forms. There is still an incredible diversity of ecological, cultural, biocultural diversity across this region. So for us, that diversity is a crucial strength for many reasons. I mean, just like biological diversity is the strength of, let's say, a natural ecosystem, similarly, cultural diversity is the strength of human systems, and the two are interconnected. And so, but as much as it's a strength, it is also a challenge. So in South Asian context, trying to do dialogues across the region means having to understand and work with different cultures of dialogue, different languages, different ways of even just relating to each other, right? You can't have a seminar of, okay, you speak for 10 minutes, somebody else speaks for 10 minutes, etc., and then you sort of end and you have a coffee break and then you come back and do the same thing. That doesn't work, right? It doesn't work with indigenous peoples who have their own pace of doing things, right? They take their own time and one has to respect that. So how do you kind of work at different time scales, different work paces, different modalities of or methods of dialogue and collective action? So these are challenges, but they're also enormously exciting.
Yeah.
They can lead to a lot of serious misunderstandings, but they can also lead to some absolutely creative and incredible moments of collaboration. Um, so for us, I think it's been very important to try and optimize the possibilities of this kind of cross-cultural and cross-thematic. We have the same challenges with cross-thematic because we are, just like government departments, civil society also often works in silos or has worked in silos for decades or generations. So the gender justice folks will be working on gender justice, the ecological agricultural folks will be working on that, some education folks will be working on that, and there hasn't been that much of a cross fertilization, that much of a attempt at trying to say, well, okay, what does your work on education teach me about my work on, say, conservation or gender justice, right? And how do we work across these? We challenge each other, but we also work constructively together on teaching each other, learning from each other, and expanding our own work and deepening our own work. One of the things that we've used, one of the approaches we've used is what we call outscaling. Because this question has asked very often to me is, okay, you've got all these wonderful initiatives all over the world, mostly small, but very scattered. Even if they're big, they're kind of scattered. They're not linked to each other. So how do you scale? And, the conventional model has always been upscaling. So you have something successful, you make it bigger and bigger and bigger, whether it's a corporation or it's even NGOs. And for us, that's not the approach to take. For us, the approach is to, and nor is it to replicate. Say, okay, something has worked successfully, so let's just copy it and use it in the same way. But it is what we call outscaling, is to learn the lessons, learn the processes, build the relationships, learn from you, but try it out in my own context with my own modifications, and then link up, as I said, horizontally to create scale. So scale through outscaling as what, and then deep scaling. So if I'm working on a particular aspect and I learn another aspect from you, I'm deepening my own work within my own context. So outscaling and deep scaling. So I mean, these are, I think, some of the things that, I mean, I can give you hundreds of examples of what's happening on the ground, but this is basically how we try and work, not without all kinds of issues and problems, of course.
No, it's extremely fascinating and adaptive in many ways as well. Are there many collaborations between you and those in the academic space still? Do you still teach, or do they get involved in this process as well when the communities are open to bringing in those kinds of knowledge systems as well?
No, absolutely. We do work with a lot of academics. I do occasionally teach. I don't consider myself an academic, but I do teach. We also do action research. Our own organization does with others. And the important thing here again is, how does one do something in a mutually respectful manner, where the local knowledge system is respected, but we also kind of go in a way where they will respect, not look up to us in the way that normally happens, because you have a city fellow going into a village normally because of 200 years of colonization. They kind of, oh, you are the expert and we are only ignorant, kind of thing. Not like that. So building the relationship of a kind where we are giving them a sense that your knowledge is as important as anybody else's, but we also might be coming in with something that might be of use. So in that kind of and it's a dynamic ongoing evolving relationship. One also has to keep in mind that the Indian subcontinent is enormously diverse, even ideologically. So I mentioned culture and knowledge and language and things like that. But even ideologically, we've had for the last several thousand years so many influences: religious, non-religious, political ideology. We have a Marxist, we have Gandhian, we have Ambedkarite, we have at least 5 or 6 of the major religions of the world. And then we have all the indigenous knowledge systems, which are not part of any of these. So often when we have these confluences, a lot of this comes in, right? Explicitly or implicitly. And one has to weave one's way through this. Now, you get a hardcore Marxist and a hardcore Gandhian coming together. Unless they have that openness of spirit and dialogue, it can lead nowhere. I mean, it can just be a clash,
Certainly.
or a hardcore, let's say, feminist and somebody who's working on, I don't know, wildlife conservation. So these are conventional divides which we have tried to break through in the Vikalp Sangam and the GTA and other spaces. And I think to my mind, somewhat successfully, because we have what we basically said is, look, we're all against a particular form of exploitation and domination. Your analysis of the roots might be different from mine, but we're both against oppression. We're both against inequality. We're both against, that way. And so maybe there's some answers in the indigenous way of responding to that. There are some answers in the Gandhian way. There are some answers in the Marxist way. Can we figure out what we have in common, but also agree to disagree on some things? That approach has, I think, carried us through reasonably well. And especially in these days, because everybody recognizes that unless we get together, there's no way we can deal with the kind of political and cultural juggernaut that we're facing in the Indian subcontinent right now, like everywhere else.
Certainly. And the polarization that is impacting pretty much every system that exists in the world right now. So yeah, finding ways to bring people together from very diverse perspectives and ideologies is incredibly important. So that's fascinating. Thank you. I'd like to ask maybe just a couple of specific questions I have in mind that might be important for others as well. What, if you can put a percentage on it, about what percentage of the Indian subcontinent is considered indigenous or traditional community?
I know the Indian figures is about 7 to 8%.
Okay.
Not traditional, sorry, indigenous, meaning what we call Adivasis. So we have it's a complicated thing. India does not accept the term indigenous peoples, it never has. So people call themselves Adivasis or tribal peoples or whatever. And the official term is scheduled tribes, which means those who are listed in the constitution as being indigenous, not using the word indigenous, but as being tribal.
Right.
And that's about 7 to 8%. But then if you were to take a number of other traditional communities who haven't been classified like this, but call themselves original peoples or Adivasis, it would probably be about 10, 11, 12%. Then if you were to include a lot of the traditional communities who are not in any of these, like for instance, if you look at across the Himalaya, the villages across the Himalaya are, in some senses, they've been living, they are living tradition, and we have been living traditional lifestyles for generations, centuries, but are not classified as scheduled tribes or as Adivasis, right? So if you put all of that together, the percentage would be much, much higher, of course. But it's fuzzy because, the dividing line is often very difficult to make out.
But that's helpful. Are they given specific rights, certain levels of autonomy in the Indian subcontinent? You work on these global alliances and initiatives. Is there any difference between the rights that a community in Colombia, for example, is given in comparison to a indigenous or Adivasi community in India? What are some differences that you've encountered, and what kind of special rights are acknowledged in the Indian subcontinent?
Well, yes, the Indian Constitution. So when the Constitution was being framed, the Constituent Assembly did have some very interesting discussions on Adivasis and what kind of, and we had anthropologists and others who were trying to influence that whole discussion to say that these are peoples who've been there for a very long time. They have special needs. They have their own governance systems. They are self-determined in many, unlike other aspects, unlike even many of the traditional communities who are part of the larger Hindu fold or whatever, right? So all of those arguments went into the making of certain safeguards in the Constitution even at the time of framing the Constitution. And these were then elaborated and enhanced in the 1970s and 80s, especially the 1980s, where the special rights of scheduled tribes to determine what's happening in their areas were recognized, right? And then more recently, around early 2000s, because a lot of these Adivasis are in forested areas, so there was a whole movement of trying to reclaim collective rights to forest, which were taken away by the British colonial empire and then even by the independent Indian state until recently. And so 2008, 2006, we got a new law called the Forest Rights Act, which enabled this kind of collective control back in the hands of forest communities, both Adivasi scheduled tribe, but also other traditional forest dwellers. Implementation of that law has been extremely poor, but that's another story. But so we do have not just of this law, but even of the constitutional provisions. For a initial period after the Constitution, actually for quite a substantial period, a lot of these areas were kind of left alone. I mean, there were so-called development inputs and all of that kind of stuff, but they were relatively okay. But then the more these lands became important for the industrializing economy of the country, these are places with valuable minerals, with valuable hydropower possibilities, etc., 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 or mass tourism. They've been opened up across the country, and now the last sort of the frontier, so-called frontier areas, especially in the border areas of India, are being targeted by this government. So we do have safeguards. Some of them have been effective, but many have also been violated repeatedly. In terms of the Latin American situation, to the extent I understand it, which is not that much, I think at least in some of the countries, the safeguards are much stronger. I mean, being able to, for instance, completely control your own territory and have self-determination in your territory in some of these countries. We don't yet. We have it in very, very limited pockets, but generally that isn't there. So, the government can easily come in with a so-called development project and override any rights that you have. So that is something that I think it's not as strong in India as it is in Latin America.
Is that something that's being, I understand the context now is quite difficult, but is that something that's been aspired for over time to give more territorial rights to the indigenous communities in India?
Absolutely. I mean, indigenous Adivasis have fought for what they call tribal self-rule or Adivasi Swashasan for a long time, and in some areas have been able to achieve this de facto or through things like the Forest Rights Act. And there's another law called the Panchayat Extension to Scheduled Areas Act, which means, again, local governance, self-governance, much stronger than in other parts of India. So these people, where there has been good ground level mobilization, they have fought for much more self-governance and self-rule, in some cases successfully. So there is another big difference which I think should be acknowledged is the intermingling of Adivasis, indigenous peoples, and others in the Indian subcontinent has been much, much greater and much longer than I would imagine a lot of the Latin American. One could be simply the fact that a lot of the Latin American indigenous peoples are in territories which are vast. If you take the Amazon, for instance, and the incursions into them, even by the colonialists, were much less compared to here, where you had settler after settler, sort of waves of settling that took place over the last few thousand years. And a lot of people kind of coming into what were Adivasi areas and intermingling with them. And so there's a lot of, and so in fact, that's one reason why the Indian government says we don't agree with the term indigenous people, because they say either everybody's indigenous or nobody is. Because there's such a long history of relationships and intermingling compared to a lot of other parts. So compared to Latin America, compared to Australia, it's much greater here. So it's more complex.
Well, certainly the story, the time scale is very different, and maybe the process is quite different. Perhaps it was more of a shock to the indigenous systems in Latin America that happened over a very short time of decades or centuries. But certainly the disruption was at a similar
at an equal scale, I would think, the indigenous communities in Latin America in terms of the diminishment of their territories or their knowledge systems or their coherence of communities. But I can understand that the context in India and the complexity over such a large timescale, it's much more difficult to decipher which community has which origins and which territories as well. It must be much more difficult to identify what are the ancestral territories of this particular community in India, based on what you're saying.
Yeah. I mean, both because of the how old it is. You're talking about 3,000 years of this kind of wave settlement, but also because the intermingling was not necessarily as it was in some cases, but nowhere near the kind of scale of violence that you saw in Latin America or in Australia or Canada, for instance. So that kind of violent clash, which was and violence not just because of outright military or whatever armed violence, but also just spread of diseases, for instance, the devastation in Latin America because of the introduction of new diseases. That kind of thing you don't see so much in the mainland India. You do see it in some pockets like Andaman and Nicobar Islands, where because those indigenous peoples were isolated for a very long time. So when settling began to happen there, they also went through similar collapses of population because of disease and other kinds of things. But that's one small part of India. Mainland India, there wasn't that much. There might have been outright killing and so on, but not the kind of sort of genocidal proportions in Latin America. We didn't see that here.
Yeah. Very different context that I imagine enters into the debate or the restrictions that are put on these territorial rights movements in India as well, because they're able to make these arguments that are not correct in many ways as you're describing them, but everybody's indigenous or nobody's indigenous kind of an argument. So it's that's unfortunate, but I imagine there are many lessons that can be learned from both sides that can then strengthen these arguments and movements on
Absolutely.
both hemispheres. Right. So well, many more things I want to ask you about, but one is your writing. At what point did you realize that it was important to communicate these issues to wider audiences? You've published a few books now. You're writing for various mediums, and these are complex topics that I think, from my experience there in India, that many people are not very conscious of, and also globally, to be able to introduce these movements to a wider international audience. At what point did you realize that was an important aspect of your work in these realms?
Well, coincidentally, I've just been looking at all my past articles for the last few decades, and the first article I wrote was 1980, so it would have been just out of school, in college, or maybe as I was passing out of high school and into college. We actually our organization produced a newsletter, because we realized that whatever we were doing, and mainstream media was carrying some of it, but clearly not enough. We needed a medium to convey our ideas and our sort of arguments to a wider public. So we started a newsletter back then. And so I was writing for that, but then I also was writing for some of the newspapers at that point. So it started then. And I was very clear from that time itself that even if I get into academics, I'm not going to aim a lot for doing academic writing, because I feel that these are issues that need to be written popularly and be conveyed to a general public. So most of my writing has been like that, for newspapers, for online, now more recently online publications, for NGO newsletters, and some, of course, academic, because one needs to address that audience also, but not so much. So yeah, I've always been interested in writing. I guess I'm lucky that I have had in my family also. If you look at it, my father was a writer for a long time, and I think my brothers also got into it, and so I took to it a bit more easily than maybe a lot of other people who don't have the same fortunate background. Yeah.
And what have you seen?
That was articles, and then I realized that putting these together or putting something together as books would also be useful because they last longer. So I started doing books, I think around the mid 1980s. When I joined, so after my college, I did sociology, master's in sociology. After that, I joined something called the Indian Institute of Public Administration, which is a kind of a government body which teaches bureaucrats who are already in service, but it teaches them things they wouldn't have learned as part of their service training. So I was doing environment teaching over there. And while doing that, also, of course, writing quite a bit. So this was for the people that I was teaching, but also for wider audiences. The institute also had its own journal of public administration, so I would write for that. But yeah, so that's been. I haven't done so much. I've done some writing for global platforms, but limited compared to what I've done for the Indian media.
And I ask this especially to know what aspect of the writing has helped enhance your work on the ground as well. Has it helped to communicate some of these topics both to collaborators in the NGO space and academic space and to the communities? Has it helped to somehow foster collaboration? Has it helped to give more pressure to policymakers because more of the public is aware of these issues? What is some of the impact of doing this kind of writing?
Well, I think one thing that I have tried a lot is to reach young audiences. Because I realized that my own upbringing, it was because I was reading other people's writings or listening to other people that I was able to learn what I was able to learn. So I felt it was my responsibility to then write in a way that was reaching across to school and college students or other young people. And there, I think, wherever I managed to get some kind of feedback from young people and ask them, has this been useful? I get a fairly positive response. To give you one example, the book Pluriverse, which you're familiar with, brought out in 2019 with 100 essays. The reason why I and all my co-editors said let's keep each essay to 1,000 words maximum, and to be written as simple a style as possible. And these were 100 authors, right? So we had to persuade them to do that, including some very heavy-duty academics. Because we said that young people especially, or those who are not really already well-versed with these issues, are the ones who should be able to read and understand these things. And I've had feedback from students across the world that book has been enormously useful for them. Because especially the current generation that doesn't read a lot. So for them, 1,000 words is like about the limit that they might read.
Oh, don't tell me that. I'm scared.
No. Well, I'm hoping that long form reading also comes back. You never know. Sometimes these things are, circular.
Hopefully.
But anyway, so young people is one major thing, and but also civil society movements, because when one writes, if one writes with the full evidence one has and the facts, but also the arguments and also bringing in emotion, it helps movements on the ground, because often these movements are not themselves able to communicate or to write in that manner. And then so people, think articles would have been picked up, let's say, even in court cases by the movements, by the communities, or picked up and, used as advocacy with their own government, local governments or whatever. So there's examples like that. I frankly have no idea how much and how far this outreach is, but I do occasionally get feedback that it's useful. And then in the last few years, I think because I've done a lot of online writing now, I have a monthly column in this online space called mir.com, writing a lot about current ongoing issues. So for instance, I think my last one was about the Gen Z revolutions and all the potential for those, but also what more needs to be done by younger generations. And that's now been picked up by some sort of people as academics, saying they're going to use it in their classes, or others saying they would like to address these sorts of issues to their own younger generations who are part of these Gen Z movements. So to me, and one of the things I argued there was there needs to be urgently an intergenerational dialogue between the Gen Z movements, which are incredibly powerful in some parts of the world, including right now, this Cockroach Janata Party in India, and previous generations, not in terms of previous generations telling them what you should do, but what are the mistakes we made, or what are the successes we've had? What have we learned from our own experiences from history? And maybe some of that is useful to the younger generations. And especially, this is what I argue in the article, to have some kind of prefigurative thinking. Now, as a Gen Z or as a young youth revolution, you can bring down a regime, like it happened in Nepal, for instance, right? Or many other parts of the world. Either bring down a regime or bring down particular ministers or whatever, effect some kind of fairly dramatic change. But then what after that? What is it you would like to replace that with? Instead of just another regime coming in and doing kind of the same thing, is there a thinking of what are the fundamentally different politics or fundamentally different economics that we would like to bring in as young people? So that's what I've argued, and some people have written back saying that that's the kind of thing that they would like to have as dialogues also in their own spaces.
Yeah, great examples, and yeah, it's difficult to quantify the kind of impact that writing can have. I'm aware of that on my end as well, but certainly part of helping form these collective voices that you were speaking about as well. So it's really fascinating. I'd like to shift a little bit here. Yourself and your organizations, at least two that I'm aware of, were very much involved with the rights of nature movement in India. And before we get into some of the limitations of rights of nature, maybe you can describe what that was like. Again, maybe tying in some of the international collaborations, how that movement was forming around the world, and then how India became, showed some of the obstacles, but also some of the potential successes for that movement, and what your role was in that.
Yeah, well, I think there's two that I'd like to speak about: rights of nature, but also the bioregionalism group that we're involved with, because they're interlinked and connected. So India has not actually had a strong rights of nature movement. It's beginning to grow now in those terms, right? There have been very strong movements on the ground, which don't necessarily use the words rights of nature, but they are about protecting nature, and like community conservation areas that I mentioned, and from our own cultural perspectives. And I'll come to that issue of, why there are limits to the rights of nature. But now in the recent past, this language is also entered, for instance, in High Court judgments on the rights of rivers. The two biggest rivers in North India, Ganga and Yamuna, have been given rights as personhood by High Court. And so there have been somewhat similar kind of things happening in other parts of the country. And we had started, I think this was 2020, we actually had a national workshop on the rights of rivers in India, and a group that got formed at that point called Rights of Rivers, not India, sorry, South Asia. A group got formed called Rights of Rivers South Asia. That's been struggling a bit recently, but that the idea was that because similar things were happening in Bangladesh and Nepal, and somewhat in Pakistan, that we wanted to bring these together and say, what does this mean for South Asia, this whole rights of rivers narrative, and on the ground, how could it actually make a difference? So these things have been happening, and they get connected to the global processes. I have been to some extent involved with the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature, and I'm a judge on the International Tribunal on the Rights of Nature. So we try and bring our perspectives from here into those global forums, and what we're learning there, we kind of bring it back here. Same thing has happened with bioregionalism. So again, a few years back, I think it was in 2019, we had a democracy confluence, part of the whole Vikalp Sangam alternative confluences process. And in that discussion, one of the things that emerged was, how do we look at current political boundaries from an ecological and a cultural perspective? Because current political boundaries within India, but also especially in the subcontinent between the nation states, have happened for whatever has historical reasons, but they have significantly disrupted natural flows and cultural flows, and even economic flows. Nomadic populations can't go back and forth. Fishing communities get caught if they just stray across a very imaginary line in the seas from between, say, India and Pakistan. Wildlife can't go back and forth, etc. So, how do we reimagine South Asia from a biocultural perspective, with re-establishing the flows, for instance, of rivers, right, or the flows of nomadic peoples, and what would that mean in terms of political boundaries? So that's the kind of sort of reimagination that we've been trying as part of what is now the Bioregionalism South Asia Working Group. Um, and also doing a historical assessment of how people themselves define their territories from a biocultural perspective. So if you look at the current map of India, the current political map of India, and the districts and the states and whatever, they are superimposed on regions that people actually had named by themselves and which were corresponding much more to biocultural flows, connections, and boundaries, right? And many of them still exist in the popular narrative and in people talking to each other. They still refer to those regions, even though they've been divided up into districts and states, which cut across these. So we also then did a detailed study of such the memory of such biocultural regions across India, which was a very interesting publication that was brought out. So these are two things, and then we connect to the global bioregionalism movement. For instance, there's a group called R3.0, which does a lot of work on this globally. So we kind of link up with them again, like, learning from each other and providing our perspectives, getting perspectives from, say, the Indo-Canadian indigenous peoples who are trying to create bioregions across the US-Canada, across the US-Canada border, and or the Amazon Sacred Headwaters bioregion initiative across Peru and Ecuador of 30 indigenous nations. So trying to create those links and learn from each other.
Yeah, amazing. And that's of particular interest over the last decade or so of my work. Rivers in particular are just a sort of almost a metaphor for so many different issues of interconnectivity and networks, complexity. I'll add into what you mentioned, the climatic interconnection with the hydrological, how important the rivers are and to preserve their connectivity to the climatic patterns of a region. So I've worked a lot with that in South America, and that made me very curious about what the context was in India as well for this, because a river is a perfect representation of, transboundary, the need for transboundary policy, if you want to call it that, or understanding at the very least. Like, nature does not work by politically enforced anthropocentric, boundaries. So how do you deal with that in the context of South Asia, for example? And I work with people that deal with that within the Amazon River Basin, for example, which brings together 8-9 different countries. So what has been some of the increase in understanding based on having this rights of river movement? And then I think that will transition naturally into what are some of the limitations of basing it on a Western context of legal frameworks?
So in the last few years, just talking about our work, the impact has mostly been building more connections across civil society in the South Asian region. We've actually not even attempted it. I don't think we've had any impact in terms of the official policies. In terms of official policies, what has been working in the last, or not working, but what has been attempted in the last few decades, 2 or 3 decades especially, is transboundary conservation. Wildlife conservation, like tiger conservation across India, Nepal, rhino, etc., that kind of stuff. But that's sometimes good, but it's obviously very limited, fairly limited. There's been almost no attempt to look at, okay, how do we ensure that, for instance, the Ganges is equally available to all the nation states through which it flows or through which its tributaries flow. And so we had this Farakka barrage built in India, which has caused problems down in Bangladesh. We are currently threatening Pakistan by saying we're going to block the Indus so it doesn't flow into you, etc. So, rivers become weapons, unfortunately. And the nation-state conflicts in South Asia being so volatile, so strong, combined with the religious, politics that is there, which is becoming much worse now. At the moment, the official appetite for something like rights of rivers and bioregionalism is very, very low. But we're trying to build people-to-people relations and contacts, and there's quite a lot of interest in people to actually at least begin to reimagine and connect in terms of narratives. Action will hopefully flow after that, but right now it's just about building that atmosphere that we need something like this amongst peoples.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's been, I sense it in your voice as well, and that's been for myself and many colleagues that have worked more adamantly in the rights of nature movement in Latin America. There's been a lot of frustration, disappointment. There have been successes in getting, major areas, the Colombian Amazon or the entire, Ecuadorian, ecosystems into law as protected rights of nature, but the actual action and implementation has been severely lacking. So,
Yeah.
so from those sort of shared experiences, I know you and your colleagues have been proposing some new frameworks that are based on different broader models. You're calling it Earthy governance. Can you can you tell me a bit more about that and how that kind of transcends the rights of nature movement and the limitations that rights of nature has? What are some of the core principles, from decentralization to all life matters to many different, core principles of this earthy governance? Can you expand upon that a bit?
So I think with rights of nature in its formal legalistic sense, which is how it's being argued in many parts of the world, it has its value within a certain framework of jurisprudence and so on, and we don't want to deny that value, but it remains within a certain framework of governance, a certain framework of law, which itself is very limiting, right? Formal Western law, which all of our countries are following, has a very serious limitation in terms of doing actually, things on the ground. It has a limitation of, okay, who has the best and the most lawyers, who has all the money to fight cases in the court and things like that. So those are some limitations, but there are also conceptual limitations, which is to say the whole notion of rights is itself a bit is contested. Just to give you an aside, when Mahatma Gandhi was asked about the UN, at that time, the UN Declaration for Human Rights was, I think, beginning to be discussed, and he was asked about that. He said, yeah, that's a good concept, but before rights, we need to talk about responsibilities towards each other. And I would imagine that from his writings and all that, he would also say towards the rest of nature. And so it is this combined sense of a mutually respectful system or systems where we do things in a way that inherently respects the rest of nature, in which case one doesn't even need to bring the formal legalistic notion of rights of nature in. I mean, in the current context, you need to bring it in because you're within a certain framework. But what we're saying is that we need to then move beyond that and break through that into understanding and learning from indigenous peoples and others who have always lived with and within nature without having to argue for any formal sort of legalistic sense of that, right? So that sense of kinship with the rest of nature, which is where, I mean, for instance, we don't have within our own families or within our own kinships or within our own friends, we don't have a law saying, okay, I need to respect you. Right? It's born out of a relationship, of relationality. So what we are then saying is, and if we think of how a lot of indigenous peoples and other local communities have governed themselves or taken decisions, of course, it's the humans taking decisions, but they're bringing the rest of nature into that decision-making process. They're thinking of it. Just to give you one example from here, we have a community in Mumbai, which is currently threatened because a certain part of a metro project it's an indigenous Adivasi community, and they've been living in a forest, and that forest is threatened, the community is threatened. And when we spoke to them, they said, look, we don't want to be displaced from here. We want to continue living in our forest. But if it is, if it happens, if it's inevitable, we will probably get a home somewhere else. Where will the leopard go? You know, when that question was posed, I was like, whoops, yes, absolutely. Or you speak to a girl, we spoke to a bunch of school kids up in Ladakh, sitting right next to the Indus River. And we were saying, okay, as children, what rights do you have? And they were talking about, we have the right to study and blah, blah, or what sorts of things do you want? So the study and all. Then so we said, okay, what about the river? What do you think? What are the entitlements of the, I mean, we use local terms, rights of the river. And one girl actually said she has the right to sing. Now that kind of blew our mind, saying, "Oh, what does this mean?" And then she was explaining that you can hear her singing all the time, and she changes her tunes and her tone. So now
Beautiful.
that kind of it's not like we're saying, okay, we have human decision making, and then there's nature out there, and let's try and respect that. It's not that. It is already part of what you're doing, thinking, being, dreaming, acting. It's part of that already. And that's why we call it earthy governance. The governance is already located within Earth as a whole. It is where other species, where the earth, where the land, where the territory is already part of how you are governing that territory or what decision making you're doing. So that's why we think going well beyond the rights of nature, we have to move towards what most indigenous peoples have always been doing. Many have lost it, but still many are doing it. So learning from that and then saying, how do we apply that in our modern context? So obviously, not all of us are going to go, are able to kind of go and live in a forest and try and regain that. But even in our cities, what would earthy governance mean? Can we actually start thinking of not rewilding in the Western sense? There is that whole rewilding thing, and I respect it. Okay, that's a good thing. But saying in our cities also, how do we bring the sense of, if there is a tree right next to my house, that I have a relationship with that tree? And if something is happening to it, then am I responsible for it or not?
And what are some of the ideas that you have for bringing that consciousness to urban?
Working with a lot of kids. I mean, having kids go out into nature, that doesn't mean they have to go to a tiger reserve. There's nature right where we are. It could be a backyard, it could be a small city forest, it would be a small city, a lake, and trying to get them to sense this. I mean, obviously understanding in terms of the sort of what the lake ecosystem is and all of that, the biological aspects, but more than that, the sense of relationship, of kinship. It's very hard, but it's possible. I think the younger the kids, the easier it is. So that's one, but also trying to do that with adults. Doing sessions where we're going out and we're not just saying, okay, this is a gray-headed bulbul, or this is a this, or whatever it is. We're actually talking about what is our relationship and what's our responsibility based on that relationship with this. So with these elements of nature. So I think that's what we are talking about, the governance. We also had there's some fascinating examples now. I remember in Costa Rica, meeting a mayor from one of the towns there, who said that I have learned how to talk to the bees in my town to take decisions on what kind of town planning I should do. And then he explained the whole thing, right? I mean, for me, it was like, how the hell do you talk to bees to understand your town planning thing? But he had his own explanation. And again, that's what indigenous peoples have been doing. But how do you do that in an urban context is fascinating, very challenging, but fascinating. But we are beginning to see examples of that.
That's really, I my mind goes towards so many questions I would want to ask some of my indigenous friends and colleagues in Latin America, because you say, like, you've mentioned thinking for the other elements of nature, and I think also you're referring to in the story of the bees as well. I mean, many of them have communicated to me the listening, and then that each of these persons or whatever you'd like, spirits as they may refer to them, have a voice, and then they can hear the voice, and then they can vocalize that voice, whether it's the river or the leopard or the tree or any. They all have a voice that the indigenous people feel that they are able to actually hear and listen to, and then communicate in a context that in the modern context can be impactful in terms of how we develop our environment and our cities, even as you're saying. I wonder how the Indigenous people feel when they're living out of their own context, environmental context in a city, for example. Are they able to still hear the nature around them? That's a question that comes to mind. I would like to ask them, because a lot of them in Colombia, for example, have been displaced from their territories because of conflict recently. So are they still able to hear the voice of the tree or the lake in the urban setting as they were in their territory, or is that lost due to a displacement from their interrelationships, the interconnections that they feel with their ancestral home, with the reciprocity that they're used to giving to the earth when they're cultivating, things of that nature. So I think those are some potentially open, very important questions within the earthy governance that you're developing. I don't know if you have any thoughts on this right now, but they're things that come to mind as you're speaking about these very profound issues.
Well, there's a intergenerational loss which is very, very scary and rapid.
Mhm.
So if, for instance, suppose if there is an Adivasi group that's been displaced from its home by a dam or a mining or whatever and has had to come into a town, the elders in that would still have that sense, and maybe they're able to then relate it to whatever parts of nature, the rest of nature exist in that town.
Mhm.
But a new generation born in that situation
Mhm.
is going to be very difficult. Not just because they don't necessarily have that kind of natural environment around them, but also because the whole imbibing of that sense is done by young people when they go out with their parents or their elders into the forest or out into the ocean and do fishing or whatever. It's not it is not like kids are sat down and said, okay, this is what we know about nature and this is what you should know about nature. It happens through doing, through being.
Mhm.
And that would obviously very, very difficult in a urban area, also because the education now happens in a closed classroom.
Right.
Doesn't happen out in nature anymore, barring a few exceptional schools who do it, but otherwise it doesn't. So in that sense, a new generation of Adivasis being born in or mostly growing up in cities, and that would probably have lost a lot of it.
Yeah.
Um,
The one
and
with
elders are not also, even if the elder wants to continue that kind of thing, it's very difficult because 3/4 of the day that the young person is not even there. They're out in some school or whatever, or the elder has to work the whole day long just to be able to make a living to survive in a city. So it's a very difficult context in which to do that.
Yeah, it's a huge challenge, and language also comes to mind as just such a massive importance for that. And I know there's an enormous diversity of languages in India, and in my experiences, the words have so much more meaning, especially for what we're talking about, the voice of the river. And their language means so many more things. It comes across as something maybe metaphysical or metaphorical to a Western trained ear, but for them, it's loaded with so much knowledge within that, what that means, the voice of the river, for example. So if that's lost, then how do you then communicate the sense of connection to the river or to the tree or something like that? So, the preservation of the language and the actual like deep meaning of those kinds of metaphors also seems to be of high importance in this kind of context.
And art forms,
Mm.
I mean, visual, audio, music, singing. One thing that's beginning to happen, it's still very, very small scale, but beginning to happen is that young people from some of these communities who have grown up in cities or who had to move to cities are beginning to realize the importance of their own heritage. And some of this happens through art forms. So combining, for instance, their own traditional music with, say, modern rap music,
Uh-huh.
or bringing back some traditional art forms, but doing it in a modern context, like a studio setting or maybe even digital formats, right? So I think that's kind of, it's still very, very marginal, very exceptional, but it's promising because I think there's a certain frustration with the kind of life that these young people are living. And if they have some connection with their roots, then they find that maybe there's more meaning in trying to revive some of that or learn some of that, but not necessarily exactly in how it was in their grandparents' time. maybe in somewhat newer forms. But I know this is happening with crafts. It's happening somewhat with music. I mean, singing and some art forms. So there's some promise there.
Absolutely. Beautiful. And transmission of knowledge through symbolism as well is just very,
Mhm.
very important for communities. One word that I've come across multiple times reading about earthy governance and that I mentioned at the outset, and maybe I'd just like you to unpack a little bit, is decentralization. What is the role of decentralization for a more, say, sustainable governance model that's based on traditional worldviews?
Well, I don't use the word decentralization so much because it assumes that there's a center and then you have to decentralize. I mean, it's correct because these days things are centralized, so one has to decentralize. But eventually, what one is talking about is radical grounded democracy or direct democracy, where we're saying that the people on the ground, whether in cities or in villages, in their own collectives, urban neighborhoods, villages, etc., are the basic unit of decision making.
Mhm.
For that area, what is most important needs to be decided by or through them, right? And then when you have larger scales, like a city as a whole, or a region as a whole, or a biocultural region as a whole, you try and figure out, okay, what is the sort of confederalism or associations that need to form with these basic units so you can actually do governance at much larger scale, but where every person on the ground still has a voice, and then nature also has a voice. So in this form, or what I've been calling radical ecological democracy, is to say we all reclaim our rights to decision making, which we have unfortunately in Western liberal democracies we've given away to politicians and bureaucrats. We vote once in 5 years, and if we don't like the party in power, we try and vote some other party into power without realizing that actually we are the ones who should be taking those decisions. Why are we allowing politicians and bureaucrats to rule over us? Right? That's not democracy. So it is that very radical meaning going to the roots level of decision making and governance and power being held by us. But power of there are two kinds of power. There's power to dominate, so power over you to do something, and then there's power with or power to, so power to do something good, power with somebody else to do something good, right? So that if you think of these two forms of power, then we're talking about a radical democracy in which we are exercising that power, but we are doing it with responsibility. What Gandhiji called, this is an old Indian term called Swaraj, which means self-rule, independence, autonomy, freedom. And when he spoke about it, he said clearly, this is not just about India's freedom from British colonialism. That's part of it. But much more important is that it is my and my communities or my collective's freedom to do what we want, to be happy, to be well, but not in a way that creates unhappiness or ill health to some other community or somebody else, right? So there's the entitlements, rights, freedoms, etc., but with responsibility for others. And why I call radical ecological democracy is to say that that responsibility needs to be for all of life, not just to other human beings, but all the rest of nature. And so this is, to my mind, this radical democracy has and earthy governance in that sense and rights of nature, etc., all have to go together. If we're looking for fundamental answers to the multiple intersecting crises that we have, it is this intersection of radical democracy, ecological responsibility, kinship with the rest of nature. And then you build into that also, of course, radical localized economies and self-reliance, an economy of caring and sharing rather than of money, and social justice issues of, say, gender justice and things like that. It's this sort of, we call it a flower of transformation. You've probably seen it, but in our framework here in India, this has evolved over the last few years. It's 5 intersecting petals of a flower: ecological, economic, political, social, and cultural. And at the core of that flower is ethics and principles: solidarity, love, generosity, diversity, etc., interdependence, and so on. And it's this flower of transformation that we have to be working towards. Many people are already working towards it. We learn from them, we kind of connect them, and we try and make these holistic radical transformations in this manner. So this is how it's all connected to us.
That's very beautiful and important and ambitious. The interconnections and interdependencies, as you're speaking about. How can I ask this? I want to, as you know, my background's in physics. I work a lot with natural scientists as well as social scientists. Been particularly involved with people working in complex system science, which is a more holistic approach to sort of data-driven science, including ecological health-related matters. I wonder, I feel like much of what we're talking about is focused on the social sciences, socio-political. What is the role of sort of forming interdisciplinarity with the natural sciences, with what you're talking about? Our world is, for better or worse, very much dominated by data at this point. There are a lot of advances in terms of understandings, not just with ecological sciences, environmental, but with nonlinear dynamics or things like that are related to river systems. What do you see the role of integrating natural scientists and those that can share a vision of like a holistic approach towards transboundary issues or large interconnected global issues with the kind of work that you've been doing?
I think from whatever I know of the sort of latest work of biologists and ecologists and so on, soil scientists, and so this whole range of natural sciences, let's say, it's incredibly exciting work because they are beginning to show that some of the narrow ways in which we were looking at the natural world, sort of from a supposedly scientific point of view, were enormously faulty. I mean, for instance, we always thought that we're the only ones with sentience or with conscience or with so-called intelligent thought, right? Homo sapiens. But more and more, what indigenous peoples have been saying all along, but biologists are actually showing, those who are studying octopuses or studying whatever, are showing that no, there is evidence of thinking, of reflecting, of being conscious of oneself, etc., that we are beginning to understand more and more exist in other species also. And I think just 2 days back, I was reading about how people have found that bees, I think it's bees, yeah, actually are showing, there's evidence that they're showing emotions of being, having pleasure, or not just in a physiological sense, but beyond that, maybe even emotional sense, right? So we, or for instance, what was shown in terms of the world, the underground web, right, of a forest ecosystem. So actually, the dividing line between what we sense through our intuition, through our experience, through observational knowledge, a lot of what indigenous knowledge does, and both science and non-science, and what the modern biologists are actually coming up with, is beginning to merge. I think that's enormously exciting. I just read a book, by the way, called An Immense World. I don't know if you've seen it, called by a American science journalist called Ed Yong. It's very heavily natural, it's very heavily Western science based, but some of what he talks about, the kind of discoveries that are being made, it's just mind-boggling what the natural world is capable of in terms of senses well beyond sight and sound and all of that, everything. But also then he doesn't necessarily make those connections, but if you kind of read that along with what indigenous peoples have been saying all along, you begin to see that there's a very crucial bridge there. And if we can explicitly make that bridge, as is happening, say, in the climate field, right, where indigenous knowledge and modern knowledge are being combined to understand what's happening and deal with it, the more we can do that in the biological, ecological arena also, the more we have a much more solid case for what we want to do in terms of protecting nature, protecting our own livelihoods based on nature. So that I think is, and then of course bringing social sciences into it. Now here also, even in terms of social sciences, again, some of what people are talking about is understanding democracy within animal societies.
Interesting.
Okay, bee democracy, for instance, there's a whole book on that. And what we could learn from that for our own decision-making processes. Again, something that possibly Adivasis, etc., have always been doing kind of intuitively, but to bring it also more explicitly into modern decision-making processes, saying that there's enormous stuff we can learn from how animals take decisions. Not all of it great. Some of it could seem to be extremely harsh and cruel from our perspective, but there's also a lot that is amazing. I mean, the bee thing that I read, I was like stunned of how decisions are taken, right? So all the modern sciences, the formal Western modern sciences, are, I think, increasingly beginning to understand that the way they have cut themselves off from the natural world and how even people live. People don't live as geography and politics and blah, 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 right? That we have to break through. And the interdisciplinarity or the transdisciplinarity that you mentioned has to be in this direction. And the more you build the bridges with other knowledge systems, the more that could happen.
Yeah, I agree, wholeheartedly. I would just say that unfortunately, in the academic structure, the incentive structure in place, it still does promote more of a silo nature. But where it is moving, the direction it's going towards, I think certainly is what you're describing, and what excites me, and what I've worked on a lot over the last several years is looking for those points of intersection between, say, traditional knowledge systems and more holistic sciences like complex system science. And I find it very, very exciting and very fertile ground for collaboration, interdisciplinary, intercultural collaboration. So that's why I ask you as well, with these frameworks that you're working to develop as well, with the Earthy governance, for example, what is the potential role of bringing in those kinds of even data-driven scientists that are able to, I view it as like the traditional worldviews and governance structures can help to inform the scientists to then interpret the data, and the data can then also support the communities and those working with the communities to then be able to concretize in a modern context, like what may be going on, to then present it to potential policymakers to be like, this is what the impact can actually be, because they do modeling and forecasting of complex scenarios of many interrelated components. So it's kind of where my mind goes, but also to what we're trying to do here is foster these kinds of collaborations and then bring people together to address some of these issues. So that's why I ask, and it just sounds very very exciting in many ways to be able to develop these kinds of frameworks that are open to collaborations that would not have been imagined by people maybe a couple of decades ago. So I think it's quite exciting. I don't know if there's anything you'd like to add to the potential for this kind of collaborative structure or worldview mindset, and just to maybe.
No, I think, I totally agree. I think there's enormous potential. We're already beginning to see the positive impacts of that where it is being attempted. But it's still far too little. So, and you're right, a lot of the higher education, so-called higher education systems, the academic systems are still very close-minded about this. And I know people who've been trying to push this in their own university spaces and encounter a lot of resistance. So even something as simple as saying, okay, can you actually do a interdisciplinary PhD where 5 people get together and get a collective PhD? And I know that 95% of the universities in the world will say, sorry, not possible. PhD is an individual thing. You have to do it alone. So just breaking through even that kind of thing of how education looks at things so individualistically and not collectively. So that breakthrough, then the breakthrough of saying, okay, these subject silos don't make sense. You have to break across them. Then the breakthrough of saying not just formal academics, but also traditional knowledge, indigenous knowledge, etc. So putting those together. So there's multiple things we have to break through, which have built up over and solidified over the last few centuries. And unfortunately, in India, where if you think of it, because we still have all of these things very strong, right? I mean, traditional knowledge systems and so on are still very strong, as is formal academics. But in India, the resistance is even stronger. People are still so stuck in systems from what the colonial powers actually gave us. Very, very hard now. And right now, though, anyway, there's the atmosphere in our universities and colleges is just so fraught because of all the religious politics, the right-wing domination, etc. It's very hard for, I know a number of academics trying to do this, but finding it extremely difficult.
Yeah, I encountered that as well when I was in India. So that, not surprising to hear, but it's good for other people to be conscious of. It's a big challenge.
Yeah.
So Ashish, is there anything else you'd like to share before we wrap up our interdialogue here?
No, I mean, I'm glad we've had this dialogue. I think, I mean, there's obviously, in all the things that we've talked about, there's a lot more nuance and complexity and so on. But, in the space and time we had, I think, it's been an interesting, I hope your viewers and listeners are, find something of use in this or something interesting.
Certainly.
And I'd be happy to remain connected, obviously, with you. But if anybody else from people who are watching like to get in touch with some of what we're doing, then we're happy. We're open for it.
Perfect. Well, thank you again so much, Ashish, for being here, and having this.
Thanks a lot.
Dialogue.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you for joining us for this interdialogue. You can subscribe to be notified of future episodes and by following us on our social media channels at The Interplex. Visit our website, theinterplex.org, for more interdisciplinary and intercultural content and to join our growing collaborative community.